And of course, you launch it and you still have weird cases in production. Someone uploads an invoice format that the model gets confused by. Yep. You can't just look at the averages. We look at every single time the model made a mistake, and we go and pull that invoice and add it to the training set and tag it correctly. You definitely have to have the culture and mindset of you are doing the row level work to get that incremental percent of accuracy, because that's what really matters to the customers. They need to be able to trust the product.
This is Deployed, the AI Product Podcast, and I'm your host, Ian Cairns, co-founder and CEO of Freeplay. Hey there, I'm really looking forward to this episode. We're going to get to hear from my old friend and collaborator, Jeff Seibert. Jeff is currently CEO and co-founder at Digits. They're building an AI-powered accounting solution for startup founders and accounting firms. And they've been at it for several years now. So they started Digits in 2018. They've been using AI the whole time, predictive models, different kinds of extraction models, similarity models, as well as generative AI in the past couple of years. And he's got lots of lessons learned, things he's going to talk about, from the tactics of how they do data review and curation for testing and evaluation, as well as some of the things they've built. They were one of the first shops to be building autonomous agents in the finance space where there's not a lot of room for error. We'll hear about how that's gone for them, as well as what they've done to make text to SQL work in a chatbot that has to do math and have reliable answers on accounting questions. So lots of good stuff in here for anybody who's building in this space. Hope you enjoy listening. To get started, Jeff, why don't you say hello, introduce yourself. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background for folks who don't know you, and maybe a brief intro to why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, Ian, thanks so much for having me. Great to be here. Awesome to reconnect. As Ian said, I'm Jeff Seibert. I'm the founder and CEO of Digits. We've been building modern accounting software for about 6 years now, and now serving tons of startups with full service accounting, combination of sort of the latest AI techniques, plus US-based human expert accountants to give you sort of the best of both worlds so you can really trust the full service offering. My background's all technical. I taught myself C when I was 12, fell in love with coding. This is my third startup. I built a document collaboration company back in 08, 09, then built Crashlytics from 2011 to 2013. We got acquired by Twitter. At Twitter, I was named head of consumer product in 2015, and then started Digits at the beginning of 2018. So it's been quite a journey.
Awesome. And it's been fun to even become a customer. You guys are building a great product, so awesome to see what you're creating. But part of the reason that I got inspired to ask you to come on the show, other than just respecting your work, is that you had been publishing this series on LinkedIn where you were talking about different kinds of AI models and implicitly the different ways you were using them at Digits and the way that, AI comes together in a product. One of your key points was it's not all about generative AI. If you really want to build a great product experience, there are places you're using generative AI. There are places that you're not. But, kind of to tee up first conversation, there's a lot of hype in this space. I'm going to ask you to go the other direction. So you're an incredible seller. One of the superpowers I saw working with you at Twitter is you could build these incredible presentations and convince everybody why they should use something. What about the opposite? Why not AI? I'd love to hear you talk about some things you've learned in practice building Digits, where AI doesn't work, where it doesn't live up to the hype, and maybe talk a bit about why you wrote that series.
Yeah, really great question. And what I love about AI is how much marketing and hype has gone into it. AI is machine learning. Machine learning has been around for a long time. Yes, there have been dramatic technology improvements over the past couple of years that really show the promise and potential of the tech, but there's still some just classic limitations. So The first one, most obviously, all of these generative models are terrible at math. And as we think of AI from a finance use case, from an accounting use case, that's horrific. So we go to extreme lengths to guarantee that we're never having any AI models do any math. We've built our own financial modeling engine, exposed our own query language. We use prompting to basically get the AI to translate between English and our own query language so that we execute the financial queries in our back end, all encrypted, all guaranteed to be accurate, and then it can write a nice response about them. So that's a classic limitation. Another one is just, of course, these generative models are highly probabilistic and highly prone to hallucination. So what's really struck me, and I think you've seen come out in the market, is so many startups so quickly assemble great demos that look very impressive on their face. And then when they go to productionize them, they actually struggle with all of the countless edge cases. And so it's been a really interesting sort of past 18 months, 24 months right now, really seeing what can actually be done for real in production with real data, with real customers, with sort of a real hardened product experience versus what you can throw together in days or a week and have a cool demo to raise money on.
Yep. Yeah. And I think a lot of folks are familiar with those challenges. We're seeing all the hype coming out of OpenAI about Strawberry and whatever comes next. Maybe the math problems are going to be solved soon. But I think the point like you made is an interesting one, right? You're using generative AI to turn a natural language query into a proper query you can run on the back end. Maybe that starts to go into where AI is working for you today. Can you talk about like just different parts of the product where AI has made the product experience better for your customers or solving some core part of what you need to get done in the business?
Yeah, unlike some previous crazes, maybe the blockchain, what is real here is this is real technology with real use cases, and it does solve real problems. The key we've learned is pick the right type of model for the right use case. So at Digits, we actually train in-house and deploy over a dozen custom models. And these are actually mostly not LLMs. These are mostly not generative models. And if you look at the full breadth of machine learning, there are some really use case specific models that are highly, highly effective. To give some examples, our core suite of models are predictive models. We are doing AI bookkeeping. We connect to your banks, your credit cards, all of the transaction activity comes in, and we want to book it to your ledger in full double entry accounting. Yep. We've spent years training prediction models on $700 billion worth of real small business transactions and taught it the basics of double entry bookkeeping and all the rules. And these models are highly accurate. And that's what's great. And they're obviously much smaller. They execute really fast. They're cheaper to host and run. And you can get really rock solid, reliable results every time you see a transaction. We use similarity models to do a lot of analysis of how different companies are booking transactions and sort of making the whole system smarter. We use document extraction models to better understand bills and invoices. It is incredible how accurate these are at understanding invoice document structure and pulling all of the text out, the line items out, the numbers out, etc. We use autonomous agents in production. We've deployed them in production since January. We believe we're one of the first in the world to do so. And those work for really specific use cases in our system to research unknown transactions. So my advice would be very intentional about the problem you're solving and what type of model and how you train and deploy it will best solve that problem versus just sending everything to ChatGPT.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, we've seen this in our world too, people that are trying to do complex document extraction using basically GPT-4.0 vision model, right? It sounds like you've done some testing, you've done comparisons there. At one point, you even published some stuff where you're talking about benchmarks you've done. Like, how do you do that work internally, as much as you want to share? Because it sounds like you are using generative AI models in production. And how are you knowing that you're doing better on a different type of model today?
Yeah, great question. So it really comes down to building out large test sets. And I mean, we have training sets, we have test sets, we have production data. What's really interesting, if you look at the accounting space versus other industries, typically in a machine learning problem set, you are paying for your source of data, and then you are paying for humans to tag it, categorize it, classify it, whatever it might be in order to train the models. And then you go through the whole training process, and then you ship to production. In accounting, that process is actually all collapsed in on itself, where these companies give us the data because they need their accounting done. We have accountants, and they have external accountants they're working with, whose sole job it is to book that data. So every single month, we have fully accurate closed books for all of these clients that we can just iteratively retrain the models on. So it allows us to get really disciplined at improving the model every month, benchmarking across all the different model types we use and have access to. And our machine learning team is constantly looking at the latest releases. We run Llama 3 in production in our own cloud. We're able to compare and contrast these models and understand the pros and cons, and then use them for the right use cases.
Yeah, and that's awesome. I think you're lucky. You have this incredible feedback loop of ground truth data being created for you by your customers that you can actually trust. So many of the teams that we work with aren't fortunate enough to have that. A key part of product design when you're building an AI product is having to figure out, okay, how are we going to build that feedback loop? How do we actually create a good ground truth? And people are racking their brains about it. You seem like you just kind of lucked out with your problem space. You get that solved.
We got very lucky with the timing on this. We intentionally started Digits back in 2018 to build a new platform where machine learning was first class. We got very lucky that some genius came in and was like, oh, it's AI, and now it's hot and popular, and there's all this energy around it. So we definitely stumbled into that. But I do think you're right. You need to be very conscious of how you're building the feedback loops into the product so that you can collect hard data. For us, it's not just the accountant's work. It's also our users, the customers going in and noticing discrepancies or adding their input to a transaction. Maybe they want it booked somewhere else. It's never going to be absolutely perfect, but we collect all of that data and we can just keep training and iterating to make it better.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I can imagine on the accounting side, you mentioned people have to close their books. You're going to get implicitly 100% of transactions will have eyes on them. You mentioned customers. I assume you mean startup founders and other people that are using digits that aren't accountants.
Exactly.
I'm just purely curious. What kind of value to get out of that data? How much do you get? I'm imagining it's a much smaller volume, but how do you factor in when that might not be as reliable? How do you use customer feedback data that's more sparse and, less trustworthy?
You're definitely right. It is more sparse. It is sometimes less reliable. The founder may think it's something, but they don't understand the accounting rules, so we don't want to bias towards that. But we basically feed every customer response into a Slack channel, and then we just pay attention to that, and we see all the activity and decide which of those to pull into the training sets. Some are quite valuable.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing to me for all the conversation about novel research techniques and the newest models and whatever else in this space. So much of the practical reality when you talk to teams that are doing this is they're just looking at a lot of row-level data and they're making judgment calls about what to do with it. And it seems like it's actually the superpower. It's a differentiating thing. For
let me
talk to that are really doing well. Yeah.
Totally. I can talk about our bill pay product where we're parsing invoices. We launched this in the spring, and we had spent a long time training custom models to understand invoices. We have a training set of thousands of invoices. And of course, you launch it, and you still have weird cases in production. Someone uploads an invoice format that the model gets confused by. Yep. You can't just look at the averages. We look at every single time the model made a mistake, and we go and pull that invoice and add it to the training set and tag it correctly. You definitely have to have the culture and mindset of you are doing the row level work to get that incremental percent of accuracy, because that's what really matters to the customers. They need to be able to trust the product.
Yeah. And I have a sense that you're not doing that work by outsourcing it. You're not shipping it to a BPO. You're not using some professional labeling product. Give us a little more color. What does that look like in practice? How are your teams doing this kind of review work?
Yeah, it's very scrappy. To be candid, our machine learning team is 3 people. They are doing all of the work. They are training the models, they're deploying the models, they're maintaining the models, they're updating it as we see these issues come in prod. So you have to build this culture of everyone is responsible end to end for the features they deliver. And this isn't just an ML mindset. This is across engineering. We intentionally have no QA. We have no SREs. Every engineer is responsible for their code end to end. We do a 24/7 on-call rotation across the entire team, just an alphabetical rotation. It creates this really aligned incentive where everyone's responsible for the quality of the product.
I think that's really interesting. The way that you all are getting your team involved is kind of the key difference that we see, or another key difference between the research version of AI that's been happening and then as things move to production. You might outsource a lot of data labeling work if you're a research team. If you're a product development team, we just find this so often. People need to be close to it themselves. They're not able to outsource it. And there is that just difference. If you're building a product, of course you want your team to be accountable. So hearing the way you talk about that.
Yeah, it's a cultural thing. It is tedious work. I'm not saying it's easy or it's fun. 2 weeks ago, we decided we had to tag this whole new data set. Our ML engineers went through and hand tagged 800 different records. And it took hours. I think it took a couple days in total, but it's worth it because you then fully understand the data you're training on and all the edge cases, and you know what to look for.
Yeah. For people that might hear you say that and think that sounds like a crazy amount of work, and you just instinctively say it's worth it. Why? What made it worth it? What's the lift that you get out of that? What's the benefit that comes from it? I'd love to hear you talk more about the impact.
Yeah, I think it's just a practice I've learned over time. So at Crashlytics, which I started in 2011, we were dealing with just truly massive data sets. It scaled to we were collecting 3 billion crashes a day. And this, by comparison, feels like child's play. And even at the Crashlytics scale, we had event streams of every event happening in the system. And we would tail logs, we would look for anomalies. I think you just have to develop this mindset of the aggregate's not actually that helpful to learn from. You want to understand the row level data. And that's where you start picking out, there's issues happening or there's edge cases we didn't think about. If you're able to instill that mindset in the team, we need to do the real work. I think ultimately the product quality shows for it. It's 100% worth it.
Yeah, I'm with you. We heard this story from one of our friends that works at one of the big research shops. They made the comment in a group, if you wanted to know who at the shop's doing the most work just looking at row level results all day, it was actually their chief scientist.
Nice.
It was like, this is just the reality. If you want to know what's going on, there's just a lot of nuance at the row level. So that's cool to hear you talk about that. You mentioned something else I want to come back to, kind of changing topics, but you made a comment that you were one of maybe the first in your space companies doing, work with autonomous agents going back to January this year. Clearly you're in a space we talked about at the beginning of the call where the difference in probabilistic responses are really dangerous. I want to hear more about that. Like, what are your autonomous agents doing? How are you dealing with this problem of a risk from probabilistic responses? It'd be just great to hear you talk about what you've learned in that space.
Yeah, I'll give you some really crisp examples. So one of the use cases we use it for is, let's imagine a transaction comes in from your credit card that we've never seen before. This could be some new business that's opened up that you spent money at. What does a traditional human accountant do in that scenario? Because this happens literally thousands, millions of times a day around the world, right?
Yep.
A traditional human accountant will go and Google that transaction string, and they'll try to understand what you purchased and like what kind of business it was, and then that'll inform how they book it in your books. This is, of course, extremely tedious, takes a ton of time, and what we discovered is actually prone to human bias because it depends where that accountant lives, what they've been familiar with. They might assume at the business that it wasn't, et cetera, et cetera. So our first agent use case was, let's see if we could replace that workflow. And we had honestly been previously using some outsourced labor to do that. And it suffers from quality issues and all sorts of stuff. Mm-hmm. And so we designed and built an agent, and we were like, here's a transaction string. The system doesn't know what it is. What do you want to do with it? Sure enough, the agent wants to Google it. So the agent does actually a remarkably similar workflow to what a human does in this scenario. And it Googles the transaction, it pulls up their site, it researches the business, it finds them on a map, it looks around. We ask it to find the name of the business, the contact info, write a short description of it, locate the logo. And the first version was pretty good, but we realized it was giving up a lot, and it was like, oh, I can't find it. And through a lot of prompt engineering and sort of iterating the different steps of the flow, we got it to be far more disciplined than actually what we've seen an average human accountant go through. And you can get it to be really self-critiquing. Here's the summary of the business. And we're like, is that really a good summary of a business? And sometimes It's like, no. And it's like, okay, we'll try again. And then it's like, you found a logo. Does that actually look like the logo for a coffee shop? No. Okay, well, try again. Find a better image for it. And through this iteration process, it's actually remarkably accurate now. So now when transactions come in that our similarity models, our predictive models don't have an answer for because they haven't seen that data before,
right,
we have the agent go out and research it and then use its responses to book them into the chart of accounts. And it's just been a huge lift.
And it sounds like you've made a bunch of progress on accuracy, but you're not saying we're at 100% perfection. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, this is a huge topic in the accounting industry right now. I do not believe AI will ever get to 100% perfection in accounting. The rules are incredibly arcane. There is a ton of edge cases. There's a ton of complexity in booking multi-line journal entries, accruals, deferrals, all of this stuff. And our goal is not to hit 100%. Our goal, and we believe, we see in the data, we think we have a clear path to hit 90%. And that's actually good. That's what you want. If you can automate 90% of the bookkeeping labor, that will be structurally disruptive to the industry, to the pulse of the entire business, and it eliminates the tedium and allows the accountants to actually do what they love doing. They love the hard problems. They love working with the business owner to understand how to book the interesting transactions. They don't want to book credit card spend all day, every day. We see this as actually a really nice balance of like, let's get the 90% taken care of. Let's empower the accountants with information on the remaining 10%. And let them make the right decisions.
Yeah. So there's got to be some workflow there, that last 10%. How do you close the gap? I think this is something people are curious about. We talk to people that work in regulated industries that are, the more you're in a regulated space or a space like yours, there's math involved, but you feel pressure, you have to get it right. People are afraid of using generative AI because it feels like 90% is about as good as you're going to get with today's tech. What have you done to design around that problem and close the gap?
Yeah, I mean, this is what I would highlight again. It's mostly not generative AI for us. It's mostly predictive models, mostly similarity models, a lot of document extraction, and sort of you layer these models on top of each other. We have over a dozen custom models in prod that build upon each other and do different parts of the problem. So you're basically creating a system to solve it you're not relying on one model to solve it. And I think one of the key points is a lot of people view LLMs as this panacea of, oh, I'll just hand my problem to the LLM and then it'll be solved. I view AI like a database. It's like MySQL. It's a technology, right? For some use cases, MySQL is great. For others, it is horrific, and you certainly don't want to use it. And you want to be really particular about choosing your database, about choosing your model types, about how you orchestrate them and maintain them and so on. What we try to do is design a full product experience that solves the problem. Some of that is AI. Some of that in accounting is just pure brute force statistics. We do a ton of statistical regression across the entire data set, and that's how you find anomalies. That's way faster and cheaper than having an AI look for it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I don't want to assume it's all generative AI. I'm definitely not. I think that's a key part of your story. There's somewhere in there where maybe I was assuming with the agent flow you're talking about that there's some generative AI running.
To extent.
I guess more what I was referring to. If it sounds like, so for people that are not as close to your product, the goal is basically, here's a new transaction description from a credit card statement or something else. We don't know what this vendor is. We don't know how to book it against the right category in your chart of accounts from accounting speak. There's some work happening in there, and maybe that's kind of where I was like more curious, right? Like, what have you done to manage those situations where you're going to end up at best case 90%, outcome? There seems to be there's some workflow where like your accountants then are double checking, like they're figuring out, how do we know if this is one of the 10%? Like, kind of curious how you solve that problem.
Totally. So we do what we can to extract as much confidence from the models as possible. And you can ask questions like, how sure are you about this? And instead of just picking a category, we ask the model for its top 3 or 5 picks and what it thinks the likelihood is between them. These feed into our statistical analysis and so on. We can use a bunch of signal data we have to develop a confidence score for each transaction booking. And then what we've done is we've designed internal, what we call transaction review flow, where it surfaces the low confidence transactions. That then, when the accountants go to close the month, look at those first, clean those up very quickly. In some cases, it is truly unknowable. For an example, let's say you bought t-shirts for Freeplay. Why? Right? Were they presents? Were they team swag? Were they marketing spend? Nobody knows except you. So we also have to productize the collaboration flows to then prompt you for input on that so that it can be accurately booked. But another way we use generative models is instead, traditionally, you'd have to write an email back to your accountant and say, oh, it was for my team. They'd then have to go book it. We actually feed that straight back into an LLM and then have the LLM suggest where it should be booked.
That makes total sense. And that's the part that I was kind of looking for. I've been through that flow even with you guys where, you get the question, hey, what's this? What do we do with these t-shirts?
Yep.
You can imagine that a bunch of times over. And I think that just gets to the point of, again, we talked about earlier when you're designing that feedback loop, you all have built this cycle where for the lowest confidence things, we do have a way to just make the product ask a person. And then when the person tells us, it strengthens the data set and you get to keep going. For people who might be curious, just, watching, listening, anything else that, you would want to talk about where you are using generative AI that's been particularly productive and helpful? And maybe like if you're willing to share, war stories are always helpful for others, but also hard to tell, places where you've tried to use generative AI models and decided that was a bad idea. We shouldn't have done that.
Yeah, totally. It has to go back to what I touched on at the beginning with the math. Our big initial Gen AI launch was this thing we launched called Ask Digits. And it basically allows you as the founder to ask questions about your finance that you would typically have to go email your accountant for. And they would typically have to do some modeling. They're busy. It would take them days to a week to get back to you. It would be this whole thing. So we built this chatbot experience back in early 2023 as everyone was building chatbots. And the main differentiator we had was we were able to hook it up directly to your QuickBooks data. So you could ask any question about your QuickBooks and it had full access to the data, encrypted, secure, and it could answer questions about it. Of course, it was so prone to hallucinating the math in very subtle ways. So you could ask it like, oh, look at my P&L or look at my balance sheet and where did my spend go? And it would pretend to answer and get something that looked close and reasonable and was just obviously not, right? So that's what really influenced what became many months long project to build out this internal financial modeling engine that we then exposed to it so it can ask us questions and get the right answer and then write a response around it. We've had a similar thing with our reports. So Again, in the accounting workflow, every month you get your reports from your accountant, your income statement, balance sheet, cash flows, and good accountants will write you a summary of what changed about your business. This was one of the immediate use cases we saw of like, okay, can we have the Gen AI just write the summary for you? And same thing, because accounting, it has to be right. You really don't want to trust it to write your executive summary.
Yep.
So instead, we've pioneered two things. We do it primarily through statistical analysis. We get all the insights, hard computed, guaranteed to be accurate, and then we construct sentences around them so that it's very clear what happened in your books. We also made it so that our human accountants can write bullets, and then the AI will take those bullets and expand it into a nice client-facing letter.
Interesting.
So that's a huge time saver, but again, the model's not asked to construct any facts. It's just told to create, like, take these points, tell a nice story around them, put them in a nice letter form.
Yeah. And it sounds like, taking those two examples, the reporting, the thing you're describing is actually interesting. You have this human workforce. You've got trained professional accountants who have all the expertise, and that's a pretty straightforward use of generative AI. In some ways, the last thing you described, hey, we're going to write some bullets, expand it into a good exec summary.
Yep.
The other two are interesting, right? Where you're talking about the first version, you tried to have the ask digits feature just do the math. It didn't do a great job. It looked close, but wrong. You built this engine on the back end. I assume this is some kind of text to SQL equivalent, where in both cases with the reporting with the ask digits, you're doing that. But what does that look like? Because it seems like the problem could just continue. So I'd love to hear you talk about how you've gotten that to actually perform well.
Yes. This was a huge engineering project, and it reveals some sort of the deeper aspects and things we've discovered about this general modern accounting architecture. The problem with having an LLM convert English to SQL is it needs to have an unnecessarily deep understanding of your database schema. And as you evolve your product, the schema evolves. When you have a product as complex as a full accounting platform, the schema is immensely complicated. So in order to accurately compute something, we're doing joins across a dozen or more tables. That is way too much for the LLM to accurately write a query for, sort of in real time as someone's asking questions. So what we ended up doing is we bundled it all up into a GraphQL schema, and we exposed a very expressive GraphQL query that the LLM can pretty easily translate to.
Right.
So then our financial modeling engine's taking that sort of expressed query and doing the actual work to write the right SQL query and so on, and return the answer. So that's the key, is how do you expose abstraction layers that make the problem you're putting on the LLM easier for it to achieve?
Yeah, maybe in some different language that people are familiar with, right? You've created this GraphQL interface. You've built a bunch of tools. Each query becomes a tool that the model can access and call. And that makes sense, because I bet a bunch of the questions that you get asked are similar, right? I want to know about X part of
Tell me how much
P&L
you
from
spent
last
with this
month.
vendor in this category, in this time period. You can break down all the dimensions they want to do an analysis over and expose those dimensions, and then it's pretty straightforward.
Yep. And then what about questions that you haven't seen before, or you haven't made that GraphQL query yet? How do you handle those in the system?
Yeah, so great question. Back to Slack ops. So if the LLM gets a question that it can't answer, it feeds it straight into our Slack. And then our customer success people monitor that. They'll reach out to the client and say, oh, we saw you ask this question. The AI told us to help. Here you go. Here's what you need.
Got it. And then do you complete that cycle? Does that turn into a GraphQL query, or you just kind of decide how important that is?
It depends how common it is. We sort of monitor for what are the themes of these extra questions. A lot of them are random, off the wall. I need tax advice. I need this. It's all sorts of stuff. We handle it with our human team.
I need tax advice isn't in the database.
Correct. Exactly.
Got it. Cool. Anything else that you've learned doing this stuff that's just worth sharing? I'm always curious, how do you test these systems? How do you know that they're working? How do you know they're not regressing? You all have been doing this kind of DIY yourselves for a while. Wonder how you got there.
That is certainly an ongoing challenge. As we're constantly evolving the models, we have a ton of automated tests, tons of trial data. We try to guarantee each model's better, but there are certainly edge cases that slip through, things people catch, and we just try to patch as quickly as possible. One of the biggest learnings, particularly over the past 2 years, as all of the hype has shifted towards AI, what people are forgetting is how critical just real systems engineering still is. You still need to build a full product with correctly architected code, databases, front ends, load balancers. None of that went away all of a sudden because there's LLMs. They've stolen a lot of the hype, but I would say 90% of our engineering effort is systems engineering. is real product engineering. The AI is a tool we use to serve some of the features.
That makes total sense. This is again to that theme about moving from research to production.
Exactly.
It's one part of the system. Well, I mean, that's a pretty good transition. I want to hear a little bit more, maybe at a higher level, right? Your background, you've been a CEO multiple times, you've been a product leader, you led product at Twitter. Talk to us about how you think about looking at a customer problem, identifying when it's right to bring AI in. Maybe my question is just even more higher level. As a product person, what have you learned about when it's a good idea to apply AI to a problem? How do you identify that? How do you think through that design process? When's it a bad idea? Just great to hear your thinking on, the product side of it.
Yeah, this is, I think, a really great question. You have to separate the problem from the solution. And we spend a lot of time with customers and with our accountants understanding the workflows, understanding what's taking the time, where like the mistakes are being surfaced or made, what caused them, and sort of design features from just a pure UX, pure design approach of, hey, let's go solve that problem. Then the question is how we implement that feature. And then you have the whole suite of tools available, whether it's traditional technologies, whether it's Gen AI, whether it's sort of custom trained, smaller models, et cetera, et cetera. So then we have an engineering discussion of, okay, what's the best way to solve that feature? One really real-time example that we're doing right now, we've had a lot of drama around just like collecting all these bank statements from banks to reconcile the books. This is a classic accounting flow. It's been done manually for decades, and traditionally, human accountants will get the PDF bank statement and type in the transactions, right? And there's been some automation of that, like obviously Plaid lets you pull in bank feeds and so on, but to do a true reconciliation, you still need to tie it to the actual PDF because that's the official legal document that the bank gives you.
Yep.
And obviously, that process is super manual. So using a combination of these document extraction models, we can now just in the background in our system convert all these PDFs to fully annotated CSVs with the raw data. There's been historical ways to convert PDFs to text, OCR and so on, and they have their own issues. We've found that these latest sort of layout-aware models are superior, so we're using them. But again, we're not marketing it in the product as an AI. We're not exposing it as an AI. The feature is just convert to CSV. And how we achieve that in the background is an implementation detail that happens to be AI models. So that's how we sort of view it as a product. Like, we're not out there trying to be like, oh, the whole thing's AI. Parts of it are, parts of it aren't. All that matters is can we elegantly and quickly solve the customer.
Yep. And that's the logic that I think any experienced product leader would say that's how you start thinking about it. You've also talked about how much additional complexity comes in relative to what maybe we could call traditional software, right? Where you're just like, hey, the designer made a mock-up, we built it, tested it, and it works. And if we were to think about like, there's a different amount of overhead and ongoing attention needed for AI systems to keep up with the data, keep up with tuning the models, and generative AI, maybe changing models, whatever else comes up. What have you learned from a product perspective about what's different about when it's worth it to use AI to maybe think about it that way, and when that additional work maybe isn't? Like, do you have thoughts on that topic?
That is a really excellent question. If you flash back to the early 2000s, the Web 2.0 era, 2005 to 08, sort of roughly around there, when the first like truly scaled online products were getting built, and they were built on MySQL, if you remember, database operations was like a full career path. And even startups had DBAs. Exactly. Yep. And that's because you had these databases and you needed someone to maintain them, because as the data set grew, you needed to shard them and back them up and like all of this overhead. And today, nobody thinks about that because they just use AWS or Google Cloud or whatever and click on Spanner and like it scales and whatever. It's so nice, right? We're in that early DBA phase for ML still, where ML operations is a real role. And if you're hosting models internally, you have to do a lot of overhead work to maintain them and deploy them and scale the endpoints and all of this stuff. So I would assume, and we're making a bet that that will continue to improve. We are, as we think about deploying ML, that hasn't been hugely top of mind for us and like, oh no, we won't be able to afford to maintain this model, because I believe over the next 18 to 24 months, that'll become dramatically easier. So it's worth it to get the capability out there, deliver the customer value, and we'll internalize that cost. If that does not happen, I think you're going to see a huge shift in the space where the overhead's really going to start biting people.
Yeah. You're making the point that you're hoping something happens on an 18 or 24-month time frame. Have you seen some of those gains happen already? Are there places where you look back, you've been doing this for a while? What do those look like?
It definitely does. I mean, we use tools like Vertex on Google Cloud. We use Titan ML, which is a cool startup out of Europe. There's definitely better tooling all the time to run these models. I'm very optimistic there. I think there's so much energy on the space, so much fast iteration, that that's probably a safe bet to make here.
Yeah. You just touched on Stack a little for people on the phone that are thinking about brass tacks. Anything else you want to tell us about your Stack, how you set up your team? You mentioned your ML team earlier, but just be curious to hear about some of the details of what are you using to make all this stuff work?
Yeah. So again, I'd say the majority is sort of traditional, just software engineering, doing it correctly. We made a couple core decisions at the beginning when we started the company. Digits is type safe end to end, and that eliminates a whole class of bugs that, of course, really matter in accounting and sort of financial products where you have to be accurate. So our back-end offline data processing jobs are all in Kotlin. Our web tier is entirely Go. That has been rock solid. We serve GraphQL, which is a type-safe API endpoint, and then it's consumed by TypeScript in the browser. So we have schemas that run all the way through with shared object types that make the system highly, highly reliable. In terms of structuring the engineering team, we run the entire company on a weekly sprint. We started fully remote in 2018, way before COVID. We'll never change that. It's been highly effective for us if you can design the whole company around that mindset, which we did. Our engineering team's now in the order of 20-some folks. We break people up into small pods, small groups. I'd say the average project is done by 2 to 3 people. And that allows us to move really fast in parallel on a bunch of stuff together. And I run an all hands every 48 hours. I've done that for 6 years. That's how you keep really tight communication amongst the full team. Everyone knows what everyone else is working on, and you can feel the progress across the whole group.
That's awesome. Velocity. We do it weekly. That's a good tip. It was interesting to me. You mentioned that you're, Kotlin and Go on the back end. You're doing a bunch of ML work. You're not a Python shop. You're not a Node. Like you're just
no Python, no
software engineering, and it works.
Exactly. And all of our agents that we're running in production, these are custom written Go agents. So we are doing nothing in Python, nothing in Node in production. It's great for experimentation. Obviously, we do a lot of notebook stuff in R&D, but anything that's productionized has to be in our full architecture, full tech stack, all type safe, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And you hit a bunch of topics there about engineering. I also know, we talked about it some, you've got accountants in the mix. When you get into this AI product delivery, what have you done to pull people into that, like the engineering sprint delivery side of things that aren't engineers and that are part of helping the AI systems work? Curious how that looks.
Yeah, so we actually run the entire company on this weekly sprint in cadence. It doesn't matter what team you're on. So the goals are very aligned across the team. We've been very successful at finding accountants that, of course, are sort of product forward. They really see the power of the automation. They want it to be better. And they run office hours every week with our product and engineering teams to understand the workflows and give feedback and how stuff is working, what we need to fix, et cetera. So we've really fostered this really tight collaboration between the two, which I don't think you can do any other way. Because again, accounting is complicated. These are arcane flows that are very difficult to understand just from first principles. So it's really important to get everyone sitting together to understand how to solve it.
That's awesome. One last question. Multi-time founder, you're making a company really work that's, running AI in production as a core part of the product. There's a lot of other founders, product leaders, engineering leaders scratching their heads right now, being pulled down this path, wondering how do we really make this stuff work and feel good about it? Any other advice for that group of people if you're thinking about really building a business and committing to your product strategy around AI? What have you learned?
Yeah, the big trap I've found, and sort of from the angel investor side, I see so many pitches where it's like, we're AI this, and that distracts from the customer need. I would really just urge folks to go back to what is the problem they're solving? As an investor, I want to hear you pitch the greatest solution to that problem. Then tell me later how you're actually going to build it and deliver it. But focus on the customer. And if you can deliver value to customers incrementally, really quickly, that they value, that they're willing to pay for, you'll have a successful business. Then you can figure out, okay, what technologies do we apply under the covers to actually make that real?
Awesome. Jeff, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks for talking to us about what you've been doing at Digits. It's great to have you. Really appreciate it.
So great to be here. Thank you, Ian. And yeah, congrats on Freeplay. Super excited for you all, and talk soon.
Thanks so much. All right, that's all we have for today's episode of Deployed, the AI Product Podcast. I'm Ian Cairns, the CEO and co-founder of Freeplay. I hope you enjoyed listening. And if you did, we'd love for you to tell others about it. Give us a quick like, share, or subscribe wherever you're listening. It makes a big difference. If something stood out to you about the episode, or if you've got feedback or ideas for a future episode, or you simply want to learn more about Freeplay, shoot me a quick note. I'm Ian at freeplay.ai. You can also find me on Twitter. I'm at Cairns. It's CAIRNS. Thanks for listening.